As was just mentioned, I have two missions during this this brief. So the challenge speaker and the keynote laid out pretty well the first one. So I'll just try to hit some of the highlights. Last year, every Thursday after this meeting, we typically have a meeting where we try to pick a theme for the following year that is going to endure long enough to be relevant at the end of the year and maybe won't be talked about by everybody before that part comes up, because the higher the relevance, the more action there is. But we thought we had a winner with this one. There has been an awful lot written about this subject by a number of people over the last year, and actually prior to when we selected the topic. So the conversation started out with, is the Trump administration an aberration, or is this a trend? And then went on to, is this a U.S. thing, or is this something that is spreading a little further? And we did kind of a quick survey of the dialogue at the time, and we saw the book by Kagan, which is pretty much an apologist for the international order and saying that a lot of people have benefited greatly by it, and before we throw it out, maybe we ought to reconsider. Followed by Richard Haas's book, which looked at the international order and as the book suggests, said it's in disarray and it looks like it's not repairable, that it's moving in the wrong direction. He did give several recommendations on how it might be reshaped or reinvigorated. And then there was the final book that by Meacham that from an American perspective talked more domestic politics, which he felt had a lot to do with the international order, which one of our speakers has already mentioned, and that our good intentions were going to get us to the right place eventually. Since then, John Mearsheimer has released a book where he does a fairly strong critique of what he calls liberal hegemony, which is what he believes over the last 25 years has been the thing that has driven international order. That was done, Steve Walt put out a recent book called The Hell of Good Intentions, which said, you know, we're kind of trying to do the right things here, but he blamed what he called the blob, the inability to extract ourselves from our current foreign policy because of the collegiality and community of security experts that refuse to give up this failed liberal hegemony worldview. And then Chris Preble put out a book that followed along the same line, but blamed the use of the military as the primary instrument in affecting that policy. So great topic, still relevant, still being written about by very influential folks. And so we said, well, what are we really asking here, and what do we want to know? And we asked the question, are Western societies really at an inflection point? Is there a fundamental commitment to traditional world order, or are we changing? And where do Western states fit in that, particularly Canada and the U.S.? Are current security policies and commitments still relevant? And have we gone back to if this international order is changing and the underlying premise of whatever tradition of foreign policy we're going to pursue is truly at an inflection point, do we need to go back to first principles? And if so, what are those first principles that we need to reconsider as our foreign policy is changing? Or is this just an aberration and it's going to happen for 4 or 8 years and then go away? And the initial indicators are that there probably is an inflection point. There probably is some change going on, and it does not appear confined either to the current U.S. administration, to the U.S. in general, or to Western societies. There seems to be a fundamental shift going on, and we thought need to take a look at this through 3 lenses. So we said we need to limit the number of places we go to look. So we looked at who we thought were the 3 regions that we wanted to focus on. But we asked our regional panelists to look at a few things to try to determine if and in what direction this fundamental change is occurring. The first one, because the U.S. is arguably a core manager or enforcer and maybe even developer of the current international order, or at least a leader in that effort, that if there's dissonance between U.S. policy and U.S. behavior in these regions, that would indicate that there is a change afoot. The second one is that all of our foreign policy, national security and national defense strategies since the first Bush administration have talked about doing this with partners, that you can't engage the world without partners. And so we said, we need to take a look at our partners and see if there's any hedging strategies in these regions, with the idea that if there are hedging strategies, maybe we have lost the ability to assure our partners that we are on a track with them that they're willing to pursue. And then the third was, are there any alternative narratives of what would replace the existing world order that are getting traction or make sense, that could be critically examined and see if there is actually a viable alternative? Because unlike Steve Walt, you know, it may not be the blob that's keeping the order in place. It might be the lack of imagination on what the next thing is. So we wanted the panelists to look at what the next thing might be, or if there's an emerging narrative. And then finally, what does that all mean to security? Because that's kind of what we're here, and that's what the commander of the Canadian Army did so well. He would have made, he's a great front-end speaker. He kind of answered all the questions we had asked from a security perspective during his talk. So that was a great, great lead-in. So I was asked in my talk then to go to the second stage, which is to prioritize the drivers of change. And what I'm asking you all to do, I'm not saying that these are them. I am saying these are them, but I'm not asking you to accept that. I'm just asking you to look at these drivers of change and how they have impacted our thinking about foreign policy and security strategy in the regions as these panels come up. So in my view, there are three fundamental drivers that are changing the way that we are looking at foreign policy in the West and our security strategies that emerge from them. The first and arguably the most important are geoeconomic factors, and there are a plethora of those. The geoeconomic landscape is changing in fundamental ways. We could talk about the role of commerce as replacing nation states. We can talk about corruption in governments and so forth, and how gangs and criminal organizations are influencing where we're going. But the single most important geoeconomic factor that is forcing change in the international order, in my view, is China and their prospect of achieving peer status and economic influence with not just the United States, but Western democracies in general. My colleague Carol Evans is going to discuss economic factors in more detail, so I will only make a couple points about this. If China's economic growth, and they'd have many problems, so it's not a sure thing that it's going to be this way, but if their economic growth continues on pace with the trend lines, it will fundamentally change the way the U.S. is able to conduct foreign policy. That change to a multilateral over a unipolar world will prevent the U.S. from continuing a policy that I'll talk about later on, but this liberal hegemony and interventionism, when you're faced with at least one and possibly many poles of power, you can no longer afford to pursue the policy that we've pursued for the last 25 years. Geopolitical factors are the next one, and I will argue there are many of those as well, but the principle amongst those is how the U.S. sees itself and how the U.S. sees its role in the world. Because as the leader of the international order and the enforcer of the international order, which is an assumption I'm making, and I'm happy to be challenged on that if that seems a little too egotistical, being a U.S. speaker in a Canadian audience, but we're certainly an influencer in this international order, and to the degree that the U.S. Foreign policy and view of itself fundamentally changes from what it's held since the end of World War II, since the end of the Cold War, I would suggest that that by itself has to have some impact on that international order. I'm going to speak at the end of the drivers about that particular aspect in more detail. Okay, so the third driver of change has to do with the power structures and the international order institutions and how they are perceived and what salience they have in driving the community or being able to manage that international order. And again, I'm not going to go into this in great detail, but I would ask you to look at each of the panels, so the regional panels, and see how that is. The last speaker, the keynote, talked in quite eloquent terms about emerging forums and institutions to create dialogue within democracies. I guess my three points here are from 1980s through the 1990s, China has been integrated into these international institutions in ones that they weren't in, like the World Bank or the World Trade Organization in 2001, to an expanded role in, for instance, the International Monetary Fund, where their influence and their contribution has increased from being fairly minor to being quite substantial. They've went from 3.5 up to 3.5 billion now that they contribute, which gives them a 6% share vote, and frankly what they're doing to drive that around the world is a change, and that change was meant to bring China into the international order and become part of it and move in directions that contributed to democracy and capitalism. But China doesn't appear to be on that track, and they're not exactly satisfied with that outcome, even with that additional influence, nor necessarily should they be. I mean, John Mearsheimer makes a point. He talks about the Monroe Doctrine of Asia and how as a rising power becomes a regional hegemon, they are not that interested in having others in their region. And he has given his talk on his book, he mentions about 50 times in China, and each time he asks them, you know, over the last 2 decades, China has had remarkable growth and has benefited greatly from this world order that the U.S. manages. And the U.S. is maintaining most of the burden of keeping the sea lanes open. Why not just accept that and prosper? He says he has never met anyone in China that buys into that. And his point is obvious, is that if the roles were reversed and we had a regional power come into the Western Hemisphere, the United States would not be comfortable with that either. So he's not saying it as a condemnation, but China has a different vision. And so another indicator of change in this international order in institutions has to do with the rapid expansion on all sides of institutions that are replacing the traditional institutions, and a change in mission of the institutions that exist. There is the fourth category that I want to hit, and it has to do with mitigators. Demographics is first amongst them. We have had policies to socially engineer demographics. They've typically failed. When I say we, I'm talking about the world, not the United States or Canada. But for instance, the one-child policy in China is going to put their ability to continue on the trends they're in in great jeopardy. I'm running out of time, so I want to get to the last one pretty quickly. And instead of messing with that, if you could hit it. So I am a practitioner. I'm not I'm not a political ideologist, and I have no academic discipline that I go to. And this makes this slide particularly good for me. I'm not talking about any theory here. I'm talking about three traditions that, in my mind, capture the range of foreign policy theories. And U.S. policy is going to ebb and flow and have advocates for each of these, no matter what policy we land on. But the U.S. foreign policy is a blend of our national interest and our ideals and values, and the tension between those. And very often our policies can be a little contradictory because there are so many voices in it, and there is that tension between national interests and our values. I would tell you that for the last 25 years, I believe we are in the liberal hegemony sphere, where we have been advancing our values at the expense of our interests in many cases, with the intention of making internal change in other countries through social engineering to advance democratic values, to advance capitalist markets, to advance human rights sensibilities within governance. And those interventions have failed miserably in almost every case I can think of. And they're kind of in violation even of the general sensibility that the ambassador talked about of the United Nations admonition that you shouldn't get involved in other people's other sovereign nations' domestic politics. But we believed and we were in a position to advance these ideals, and or thought we were, and found out that we aren't very good at it. So we move into the realist camp, which is the Mearsheimer and Walt camp, and Preble, that talk about state power, and going back to what we did through from World War II through most of the Cold War, which is talk about the relationship between sovereign states, and to work together as in partnership, very often through our partners, with a partner-first approach to achieve certain outcomes. That's a very appealing and has worked in the past position that many people want to go back to. It is heavily dependent on nuclear deterrence to keep the threshold down, and it results in acts of military conflict that goes to war to maintain balance between powers when it comes out of balance. And so there's the goodness of that is you have fewer of these interventionist, low threshold wars and conflicts, but when you do have one, it's typically something significant to coercively adjust the balance of power. And then we have what I believe that we're in now, which is a Jacksonian nationalism, which arguably the Trump administration is in. And I will only hit a couple of things on this because I'm short on time. The first one is, it is not isolationism. And it is not an America alone policy. It is America first policy. The vitriol that goes with this dialogue in the United States, and I'm hearing a little bit here in Canada, does not recognize the true motivation of the nationalist movement. It is not an isolationist tendency. It is a tendency it is a rejection of 25 years of interventionism from liberal hegemony, and saying, we want to work with partners in many, many ways, but we're done doing multilateral things where the partners kind of gang up and for all good reasons, if I was one of the partners, to leverage the U.S. position, and don't want to do that anymore. And I want to work with other partners, but it's on an ad hoc basis. It is, we got a problem, or we have a challenge, or we have an opportunity, and we're going to put together something where we're going to work that with you. But that doesn't mean we're going to work on the next thing with you. In each case, we want you to take care of your national interests, and we'll take care of our national interests, and we'll be much less likely to get into a conflict over that. And with that, I have several more points, but I'll do them during Q&A as my time has expired.